Party of losers spices up latest GOP debate. DeSantis-Haley showdown no match for Evil Genie Ramaswamy. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley would really like to tear each other apart to claim the donor-approved mantle of being, not Donald Trump. But someone keeps getting in the way. You're just scum. Mrs. Haley spat during Wednesday night's debate with unbridled contempt and laser hatred in her eyes. That was after she threatened to use her 5-inch heels as a weapon to physically attack her opponent right there on the stage. Only the opponent she tangled with all night was not Mr. DeSantis. It was the endlessly disruptive and highly entertaining biotech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy who kept stepping in between Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley to absorb blows and lay down withering fire of his own. In addition to Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley, Mr. Ramaswamy flamed the debate moderators, GOP donors, the Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna Romney McDaniel and Canada. "We've become a party of losers," Mr. Ramaswamy declared one day after Republicans somehow managed to defy history and lose ground in Virginia elections during the historically unpopular presidency of Democrat Joe Biden. But when Mrs. Haley and Mr. DeSantis tried squaring off to win control of the GOP like a couple of practiced fencing artists in white suits, Mr. Ramaswamy suddenly appeared like a genie out of a bottle, looking like a cross between Elvis Presley and a vampire. "Do you want a leader from a different generation who's going to put this country first?" the evil genie asked. "Or, do you want Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels? In which case, we've got two of them on stage tonight." Mr. DeSantis is famously slow to register human emotion. But he could hardly be blamed for taking a minute to realize that it was not just Mrs. Haley's entrails slopping around the floor of the debate stage after Mr. Ramaswamy's agile knife work. Mr. DeSantis even looked pleased for a half-second before realizing he, too, had been gutted in the exchange. Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels was also a reference to Mr. DeSantis, who has been dogged on the campaign trail for wearing lifted, cowboy boots to make himself appear taller. I know these debates are really supposed to be all about policy and important political positions at a moment when our country is going down the toilet, but it really is hard to concentrate on all that boring stuff when you have a real-life scene right out of Hannibal Lecter where the evil genie is feeding a guy's brain to himself, and the guy is still smiling between bites. Meanwhile, on the front row of the debate hall, top Republican donors looked at each other and nodded vigorously. "That's a great idea. Dick Cheney in 3-inch heels. You think we could get him to come out of retirement, transition to a woman, strap on a pair of high heels and run against Donald Trump? Now that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin is out of contention for 2024, GOP donors are willing to try anything. And if anyone in drag could lure them into the LGBTQ tent, it would definitely be Dick Cheney in fishnets and stiletto heels." Meanwhile, Mr. Ramaswamy was not done with all his magic voodoo up on the debate stage. As Mr. DeSantis and Mrs. Haley desperately tried shimmying up the greasy pole to make headlines by attacking each other, the evil genie came in for perhaps the most devastating evisceration of the night. Noting that Mrs. Haley wants to ban the Chinese spyware social media company TikTok, he observed that her own daughter was actually using the app for a long time. Mr. Ramaswamy turned to her and said, "You might want to take care of your family first," drawing a flush and malevolent stare from the shocked Mrs. Haley. "Leave my daughter out of your voice," she raged back. Mr. DeSantis could only watch uncomfortably as the two sparred. At one point, he hiked his hands onto his hips and tried to look normal. But that's not to say the entire debate was hopeless. Yes, we are more than $30 trillion in debt, and Social Security, along with welfare programs to feed the poor, are nearly bankrupt from government spending by politicians. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, however, denied that he and his family are the ones draining the food stamps program, which he nevertheless supports. "Fortunately, I have never had to have my family on food stamps," he said. "But I'm glad it's there so no one in this country goes to bed hungry at night. So, really, it could be so much worse." Party of losers spices up latest GOP debate. DeSantis-Haley showdown no match for Evil Genie Ramaswamy. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley would really like to tear each other apart to claim the donor-approved mantle of being, not Donald Trump. But someone keeps getting in the way. You're just scum. Mrs. Haley spat during Wednesday night's debate with As House Speaker, Mike Johnson is as dangerous as Jim Jordan. If you are feeling any sense of relief that Jim Jordan won't be the next House Speaker, stop and worry again. The new Speaker, Representative Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana, might be more dangerous than the firebrand Ohio Republican. For Jordan's shirt sleeves demeanor and wrestler's pugnacity, substitute a bespectacled, low-key presentation, a law degree and an unswerving commitment to conservative dogma and former President Donald Trump. This is not an upgrade. It is Jordan in a more palatable package, evidently smoother, seemingly smarter and, therefore, potentially more effective. Johnson, now serving his fourth term in Congress, was the moving force behind a Supreme Court brief that helped lay the shoddy intellectual groundwork for January 6, 2021. In December 2020, he rallied fellow Republican lawmakers to support Texas' brazen bid to overturn the election results. In a lawsuit that fizzled almost as soon as it was filed, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sought to have the Supreme Court intervene in the election by blocking the certification of Electoral College votes in 4 swing states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan and Wisconsin, where voting rules had been changed in the course of the election and voters, not coincidentally, had favored Joe Biden. The justices swiftly rejected the case, tartly noting that Texas has not demonstrated a judicially cognizable interest in the manner in which another state conducts its elections. But not before Johnson rallied the GOP troops to sign on to a friend of the court brief backing the Texas lawsuit, and took pains to emphasize that Trump was keeping score. He said he will be anxiously awaiting the final list to review, Johnson wrote on what was then Twitter. Johnson later told the New Yorker's Isaac Kotiner that he regretted that wording. "It did not cross my mind that somebody would interpret it as making an enemies list or something," he said. "It should have, in hindsight. It was a very casual conversation. The president was not making a threat. Nor was I, of course. Of course not." Purity test or no, 126 of his House colleagues fell dutifully in line. The Johnson brief was a full-throated endorsement of the independent state legislature theory, ultimately rejected by the Supreme Court in 2023's Moore v. Harper. The brief asserted that under the terms of the Constitution, only state legislatures, without any review by state courts or involvement of other state parties, have power to set rules for choosing presidential electors. The clear authority of those state legislatures to determine the rules for appointing electors was usurped at various times by governors, secretaries of state, election officials, state courts, federal courts, and private parties, the brief argued. Due in large part to those usurpations, the election of 2020 has been riddled with an unprecedented number of serious allegations of fraud and irregularities. National polls indicate a large percentage of Americans now have serious doubts about not just the outcome of the presidential contest, but also the future reliability of our election system itself, it continued, as if the supposedly serious doubts had not been sowed by Trump himself. Don't rely on the assessment of Democrat Josh Shapiro, then Pennsylvania's Attorney General, now its governor, that Texas' effort to interfere in those states' determinations was a seditious abuse of the judicial process, as he told the justices. Rather, listen to Texas Republican Representative Chip Roy, no liberal squish, who declined to sign the Johnson brief and denounced the Paxton bid as a dangerous violation of federalism that sets a precedent to have one state asking federal courts to police the voting procedures of other states. Not that this stopped